Today's Being with Jesus study, we come to chapter 23, and it started with actually the last verse of Acts chapter 22. And I will title today's sharing as God's presence in the chaos. Now, if you want to summarize the outline of today's reading, actually it can be just summarized in 5 points. First, Paul was brought to the Sanhedrin, and then, in a sense, he leveraged on the Pharisees to be on his side and defended for him. And while in the midst of all this chaos, Jesus appeared and comforted and encouraged Paul. And then there was a plot to kill Paul. And later on, the last part of Acts chapter 23, we read Paul was escorted by many Roman soldiers all the way to Caesarea. But then there's a lot of things that we can look into instead of just these 5 points. Firstly, in the early chapters of the book of Acts, the last part, when Paul has arrived back to Jerusalem, we read that when he was arrested, he was put on trial in front of a crowd. So that was largely the audience that he is faced with. In the later part of Acts chapter 22, when Paul revealed that he's a Roman citizen, now he's no longer an ordinary person that can be simply pronounced guilty. So he has to go through now the proper Roman legal process. So we started with today's reading, Acts chapter 22, verse 30. The commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the law. So the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. This verse shows us that God has turned Paul's persecution into an opportunity to witness in front of the Jewish highest council, the Sanhedrin. First thing we can learn here is when there is opposition, in God's plan, it is an opportunity. Now, there are similar incidences which we can see the same pattern on how God has planned it such a way that when Paul explained or defended his ministry across many, many locations. Quickly, we just want to fast forward. In the next few days reading these places, apart from Jerusalem, then he moved to Caesarea. And throughout all these places, Paul had the opportunity to share in front of different groups of people. That's what Paul mentioned in Acts chapter 22, verse 21. Jesus told him, "Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles." That is how God has turned the situation around, whereby Paul's audience now encompasses all walks of life, including the Sanhedrin. Then we start now into chapter 23, the book of Acts. It begins by Paul telling the Sanhedrin, "Brother, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." Bear in mind, the Sanhedrin, well, they could be the same group of people who were meeting at the same place or the same room when Stephen was interrogated and Stephen defended himself before he was martyred. And very likely so, Paul could be there and could have been the prosecutor or the persecutor. Paul is now saying to his fellow brothers in the Sanhedrin, about his sincerity in serving God was never in doubt. And he will always do the best, even before he has this encounter with Jesus on the way to Damascus. In the past, he's a persecutor of the way. Today, he is an apostle, empowered by Jesus to tell people about the way. Now, by telling his fellow brother as a Pharisee, no way Paul is saying that he is disrespectful of the law, which is what they are trying to accuse him of. Paul's upright conscience is evident in other letters that he has written. For example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4, my conscience is clear. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 12, we can say with confidence and a clear conscience. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 19, cling to your faith in Christ and keep your conscience clear. And lastly, 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3, I thank God for you, Timothy, the God I serve with a clear conscience. So in a sense, just by simple one verse, we can see evidently Paul's allegiance in serving God. What a lesson for all of us to follow. That in the midst of opposition, persecution, Paul stood there and said, my conscience is clear. My sincerity in serving God has never changed. Now, let's read further. In verse 2 to verse 3, and at this, the high priest, after hearing what Paul has said about his conscience is clear, ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Verse 3, then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. Now, Paul's outburst against the high priest Ananias is very significant. When Ananias commanded Paul be slapped on the mouth, Paul rebuked by calling him hypocrite, some version of the Bible, or in Greek, whitewashed wall. Now, this command to strike Paul, in fact, was illegal, as in Deuteronomy 19:15, because the fact of the case against the accused, okay, the facts to be built out, or the case must be solid before the accused person is guilty. So clearly, Ananias has broken the law that he pledged to. Now, what is whitewashed wall? Paul, in fact, quoted from Ezekiel chapter 13, verse 10 to 16, which we can see on the screen here. It is to describe the high priest or those who surround him, that they are a flimsy wall, covered by whitewash to conceal a faulty construction. As in verse 10 in Ezekiel chapter 13, it is as if the people have built a flimsy wall, and these prophets are trying to reinforce it by covering it with whitewash. Hence, Paul indirectly was implying the council, the people sitting in the Sanhedrin, they are expected to represent or observe the law, and yet they broke it blatantly, so easily. Then God's wrath will be upon them. As we read in Ezekiel chapter 13, verse 13, therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says, I will sweep away your whitewashed wall with a storm of indignation, with a great flood of anger, and with hailstones of fury. Now, by no means, Paul's critic is neither intentionally done nor being sarcastic, since he didn't know that Ananias is the high priest. Because Paul, truly, he is very, very respectful of the law. Therefore, when in verse 4, those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's highest priest?" Immediately Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest." And he quoted from Exodus chapter 22, verse 28. "Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people." So his quote of Exodus chapter 22, verse 28 signifies again his respect for the Jewish institution and the Jewish law. And this is a lesson for all of us, because a lot of time we were told, "I didn't know you were a Christian," exactly what Ananias has done. Because we hold our own value against others, and then we make quick judgment or criticism to the extent of using Bible verse to admonish others. That is why I believe when Paul, in a sense, rebuked the Sanhedrin using the example of whitewashed wall, it is a lesson for church. It is a lesson for Christians like us. Do not fall into the same pitfall like Ananias, that we became whitewashed wall. Next, we come to the part where there's a twist of event. I call it the Pharisees versus the Sadducees, from verse 6 to verse 10. Now, before that, I managed to find a video from the internet that explained the difference between the Pharisees and Sadducees. Let's watch this video before I proceed again from here.
Two of the most common groups mentioned in the New Testament are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And these two groups of Jewish people were opposed to one another and also set in opposition to Jesus in the Gospels. So let's take a look at what they believed and some characteristics of their groups. So the Pharisees were experts on the law, or the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Old Testament and includes the laws that were given to Moses and given to the people of Israel. Now the Pharisees were experts, and they also believed not only in the law itself, but in the oral law. And the oral law, they believed, was the gift given to Moses for interpreting the law. So the Pharisees not only believed in the letter of the law, they also believed in the importance of interpreting the law. And so therefore, their focus on the laws made holiness or sanctification possible outside of the temple through following the law. And this is why we have just below the picture of the Pharisee on the left 2 icons to help remember the characteristics of a Pharisee. One is an image of the Torah on the left, another image of the mouth, to remember that they believed in an oral law and in an interpretation of the laws. And later on, after Jesus died, there was some of the laws and interpretations were written down in important books that were used by Jews for centuries and millennia afterwards, which is why the rabbis of today, the leaders of the Jewish people today, are traced back to the Pharisees. After the temple was destroyed, the Pharisees lived on. In the image of the Pharisee, you can see 2 important things. One is on the hand of the man is a phylactery, and these were boxes that contained the law, contained writings of the law in little boxes, either strapped to their heads or strapped to their hands. And they also wore blue fringes on their mantle. You can see the little the white garb on his head and around his shoulders. The Sadducees were priests. They were a priestly class, probably traced back to the high priest Zadok. They considered the temple to be required for holiness. So they were followers of the law, and looking at the parts of the law that talked about sacrifice and the temple, that's what they focused on as their path to holiness. Now, one important thing that was clearly stated in the New Testament was their resurrection was, according to them, the resurrection was not going to happen, that there was no afterlife, that there was no resurrection of the dead, which clearly would be opposed by Christians who Jesus was risen from the dead, so Sadducees would have rejected that belief. And they were more upper class. They were associated with the ruling class of the Palestine, of Israel, of the Greeks who were ruling the area. So the two icons to help you remember what they were all about are the image of the temple on the left below the picture, and then an image of a gravestone, and just to remember that they don't believe in the resurrection and they don't believe in an afterlife. So these two groups were actually quite opposed to one another. It probably isn't as clear in the New Testament that they were really rejecting one another in their beliefs. So they were very different in what they believed. Of course, in the left, the Pharisees accepted the law as the path to holiness, and the Sadducees focused on the temple. And of course, when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, the Sadducees, their path to spirituality was more or less of dying away, and which is why the Pharisees were able to live on, and the synagogues were able to be so important in Judaism. So the differences between the two of them are kind of what we talked about already: the interpretation of the Torah versus the Torah alone, resurrection of the dead versus no resurrection, belief in an afterlife for the Pharisees and no afterlife. So the differences between these two groups and Jesus is Jesus was often projected as opposed to Pharisees because the Pharisees accepted strict interpretation of the law, and Jesus was saying that it's not legalism, but himself. He's the fulfillment of the law. And for the Sadducees, Jesus is of course resurrected from the dead, but he also described himself as the temple. He was even killed for saying that the temple would be destroyed and rebuilt in 3 days. So these two groups were important groups of the New Testament, and important to understand why Jesus was rejected by the Jewish people during his ministry.
Paul, being a Pharisee, obviously he knew about the deep-rooted displeasure between the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the Sanhedrin. Now, some say that the Pharisees, they were the minorities. And we learned, even through these few verses, there's deep doctrinal so-called arguments, okay, between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, since the Sadducees only believe, okay, the so-called Genesis through to Deuteronomy, and they don't believe in resurrections. And so it is very obvious that Jesus, who resurrected from his death, it is not acceptable. But the Pharisees, on the contrary, believe in resurrection, though they still deny that Jesus has resurrected from the dead. And Paul's encounter with him on the road to Damascus, they partially accepted by arguing that Paul could have a spiritual experience because they believe in spirit or angel, and that is what Paul had seen. Now, was Paul being cunning or being shrewd, as some people said, by making use of the Pharisee? Rightfully no, because Paul knew that he would not get a fair hearing. So rather than being manipulative, Paul stirred up the conscience of the Pharisees for the truth that they hold on to, which is the resurrections of the dead. So as a result, the council was split. And Paul suddenly now had a strong defense team arguing for him. So Paul used doctrinal approach, rightly so, to speak the truth boldly. And that is the centrality of Christianity on resurrections for the dead. Again, what we can conclude from here is that God will prepare people when the truth is shared, as long as one is ready. And just like Paul, he's ever ready, he's courageous, and he is bold in front of his persecutors. So God will prepare people in unexpected manner. By now, Paul must be very, very exhausted, because from incidents to incidents, ever since he has arrived in Jerusalem, he was in chain, he could have been beaten, and a constant barrage of accusation hurled at him, which he had to defend over and over again. And yet, in such trying moment, Jesus appeared to Paul. In verse 11, the following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem. So you must testify in Rome." Jesus appeared. Some versions say stood by. And it's such a boost for Paul to regain his physical, emotional, and spiritual fortitude in facing the coming unknowns. Now, sometimes we do long to receive encouragement when we are beaten down. But Jesus' simple word, "take courage," to Paul, is such a reminder to us that God truly, he will guide us through whatever situation he has called us to do. And in Paul's case, he will testify in Rome, and ultimately he will be martyred there. And because of the encouragement that Paul has received, he reminded us in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 18, that we need to pray in the Spirit all the time, every occasion. Stay alert and be persistent in prayers for all believers everywhere. Verse 20, Paul said, "I'm in chain now, still preaching this message as God's ambassador. So pray that I will keep on speaking boldly for him as I should." That is God's assurance for Paul and for us. When we are down, God, Jesus, stood by and give us the encouragement that we need. Now, the last part is about a plot to kill Paul. 40 of them have taken a vow. And there are cases earlier, if you refer to 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 24, whereby a group of them took an oath that they will not eat until the enemy is destroyed. This is the extent of this group of people in trying to kill Paul. And sadly, the chief priest, the Sanhedrin, and others, they joined in this deception. Interestingly, because earlier the Pharisees, in a sense, has turned to the good side and defended for Paul. But right after that, after arguing over the truth and differences on the beliefs, they go back to their old way. they focus back on protecting their power and position in the Jewish society. And just like what they had done, many years ago, they plotted to murder Jesus. But then, Paul's nephew must be a very young boy. He was the unsung hero because he was unnoticed by many. But one thing we must not forget, he has what we call the guts to tell Paul. And he has the guts to tell the news to the commander. Even though hatred has blinded the chief priest and those surrounding him. But here we saw God used an unnoticed person to turn the situation around so that the commander will believe this young boy's word. We also need to take note of the commander. Not only did he hear, he believed, and he took action. He truly is a man of integrity because he wants to get to the bottom of the truth. Paul was alone, but God was with him and used many unsung heroes to accompany him to complete his mission. Now, today's reading, as I say, even though can be summarized in 5 points, what we can conclude here is definitely this is God's providence. God intervened, God supplied, because there is a purpose for that, and his plan must be fulfilled. His plan must be carried out. And this is what Paul has been called to do. It is such a great lesson and a reminder to us in the midst of opposition through our own lens. It could be hardship, but through the lens of God, in fact, it is an opportunity so that more and more people can come to know him. With that, I end my sharing today.